Hi, I'm Marilyn McPhee, and I have a story for you. It is a story that comes from the Shetland Islands. Once long ago, there was a woman named Mallie. Now, her husband had been lost at sea, so she was a widow, but she was not alone. She had three sons, fine young men. They were teenagers, and as with all teenagers, they seemed always to be hungry. Because they were poor, it was very difficult for Mallie to buy enough food to keep her boys' hunger satisfied. Now, at the beginning of the winter, she had tried to put away what she could. So she had a large sack of potatoes and a barrel of herring and a large wooden box of oatmeal. And they did what they could to ration their supplies. But finally, it became clear that the food was going to run out before the winter did. And so, on the night that they ate the last of the potatoes, and the last of the herring, and the last of the oatmeal, Mallie told her sons that there was no more food. "Whatever shall we do, mother?" they said. "We will do what we must," she said. "We will have to beg." And the boys all looked at each other, and finally the eldest said, "I will go to the neighbor woman. She seems to always have plenty of food. Perhaps she can share with us." And so the next morning he set off through the snow to the neighbor woman's house. He knocked on the door and she answered. "What do you want?" she said, quite harshly. Now the boy could see behind her into her kitchen, and there on the shelves, oh, there was so much food, bread and meat and vegetables, so much food. He said, "We have nothing to eat. Do you have something you could share?" "I can't believe that you would come begging. Be gone and don't come back." That's what she said, and she slammed the door in his face. Now, although the young man was practically an adult, tears began to trickle down his cheeks. He went home and he told his mother and his brothers what had happened. He said, "She was so angry. She was so harsh." And Mallie said, "Some people are like that, son. Be glad that we are not." Now, later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door, and when Mallie answered, there was a man standing there, an old man dressed in rags. "I have been walking for 2 days," he said, "and I am cold and tired and hungry. Can you help?" "Of course," said Mallie. "Come in. We have no food to offer you, but at least you can be warm by our fire. We have plenty of peats." And so the man sat down. Well, Mallie began to think. Maybe there was a little something, she thought. She looked in the barrel and there were no herrings, but there was a bit of brine. And she took a fine brush and brushed the lid and the crevices of the oatmeal box and finally had a little pile of meal. So she mixed the brine with the meal. She divided it into 5 portions, and each of them took a portion, although the truth was Mallie had reserved very little for herself. And then she invited the man to stay the night. She said, "We don't have an extra bed, but you can sleep here by the fire and keep warm." In the morning, one of the sons went to a well for water, and a cup of water was all they had for breakfast. And then the ragged old man set out, but he paused at the threshold and turned back and spoke to Mallie. "Was that truly all the food you had?" "Every bit," she said, "and now we have not even a crumb." "Well, bless you, woman, for having shared the last of your food with a stranger." And the man set off down the path. Well, they shut the door and they looked at each other. They knew they had no food at all. "Well, at least we can be warm," said one of the boys, and he went outside and returned with a basket full of peats. They were large peats, and Mallie took one and broke it in half. And as she did, something fell out of that peat and clinked onto the floor. it was a gold coin. She broke a second peat, and there was another coin, and in fact, there was a coin in each of those peats. And they all looked at those coins, and they realized that that ragged old man had not been just a man, but a Trow who had been thanking them for their kindness. And so the next morning, Mallie took the gold into the market, and she bought all the food that they needed. She went home, and they had a feast, a modest feast, but they all looked at each other and said, "We need never be hungry again." Well, the word got around, and the neighbor woman heard about Mallie and the food that somehow she'd been able to obtain. And the woman wondered how that could be. And so one night, under cover of darkness, she sneaked up to Mallie's house, and she peered in the window. And she watched as Mallie broke a peat and gathered up the gold. And so she went to the pile of peats by Mallie's house and carried away as many as she could hold. Then she returned to her own house and sat down in eager anticipation of the riches. She took one of the peats and she broke it in half. But it wasn't a piece of gold that fell out of that peat, but rather 2 mice who scurried off into her house. Well, she took another peat and broke it in half, and 2 more mice. You would think that maybe she would have stopped, but no, she continued until she broke in half every peat she had stolen from Mallie, and there were mice and mice and more mice, and they scurried throughout her house and into the larder, where they ate every crumb of food. Now the neighbor woman went hungry for 2 days, and then she made her way over to Mallie's house. She knocked at the door, and who should answer the door but the same young man that she had turned away from her home just days before. "I have no food," she said. "I'm hoping that you can share." And the boy said, "Of course, we will share with you just as much as you shared with us the other day." And he slammed the door in her face. Mallie heard the door slam, and she said to her son, "Who was that?" And he explained that it was the neighbor woman who had come begging for food, and he seemed quite pleased that he'd been able to treat her in the same way he'd been treated. But Mallie said, "Of course you remembered how you were treated by her, but I hope you also remember what I said to you. Some people, son, are like that, but we are not. Open the door." And so the boy opened the door, and Mallie invited the neighbor woman in. She said, "As long as we have food, we will be happy to share." And so it was that years passed, and Mallie's sons grew up to be men. But the people of the village always said that there were never men who were kinder and more compassionate and more generous than Mallie's sons. And that is the story of Mallie and the Trow.